Thank you, everybody, for joining our November webinar. As a part of using Zoom, which actually I think at this point everybody's quite familiar with, feel free to unmute yourself should you have any questions you want to participate. You can also use chat message to ask your questions if you don't want to jump into the conversation, but feel free to do so. I do ask people to please mute yourself when you're not speaking so we can have the line perfectly clear. Okay. But again, if it gets noisy, I'll mute everybody, but you still have the ability to unmute yourself. PMO Advisory is a PMI-RMP. And for our November topic, we thought we'd focus on sort of not a particularly popular topic, but I think an important topic for all of those who's looking to complete their PMI certification application. And in particular, we're going to focus on the PMP, PgMP, and PfMP. The other ones are relatively simpler, and they're more like PMP. So in that sense, you cover almost all the applications. My name is Dr. T. Wu, and I am the CEO and founder of PMO Advisory. Here you can see a little bit of my background, my experience. The big takeaway is that I have essentially three sides to my job, to my professional career. On one hand, I am a hands-on practitioner. I still run a company. I still manage consulting projects. I develop training for my company, and often that's how you interact with me. I'm also a teacher. I teach at multiple places, Montclair State University, also at China Europe International Business School. And the third is I'm also an active volunteer in multiple places in the project management world. I'm for example, on the U.S. Technical Advisory Group that really is a mirror committee on the International Standard Organization for Project Program and Portfolio. I also being a member of volunteer on the global standard with PMI on portfolio management as well as on risk management. And currently, I just recently got a new role helping New York City chapter, which I live fairly close with, to be the director of symposium for 2021. So I'm fairly engaged in the project management community in various capacity. And what I'd like to bring my experience together is those three views, from a very practitioner-oriented view, from a more academic and research and training view, and then from a standard committee member. So today's topic is really on the application and what are some of the tricks and tools, the do's and don'ts about the PMI application. All our webinars are meant to be interactive. So again, feel free to jump in. Don't be afraid of disrupting me. If we run out of time or it's too disruptive, I may ask you to hold off. But generally, we have the opposite problem, not enough people engaging. So feel free to just jump in. Also use the chat to ask questions. So let's get started. First, I'd like to talk about the PMI World Certification. Actually, it's been growing recently. When I first put together this presentation, they only did have 8. Now I call it the traditional 8. Because if you go on PMI website, you realize they're coming up with a bunch of badges, which I'm not exactly sure how to count that. And then with the Agile, they have the entire discipline Agile set of certifications. So right now, it's really more than 8. But I still call the 8 traditional ones that's been around for the last 7 years almost, I think, as the traditional 8. So here you can see the number of active certification. This data is pretty recent. I just pulled that up not too long ago. The good news for those who's looking for certification is, of course, PMI is very well known for its PMP. And just to give you a sense of its growth, when I became PMP certified in 2003, many years ago, of course, there was about 7,500 of us. Not huge. My CEO at the time was so happy, I actually sent an email to the rest of the company, not a very big company, but congratulating me. I still remember that. It was rather touching. Today, of course, there's 1.some million, and these are active PMPs. So the growth of profession is like, if you draw a line, it's a really high slope. And I think today, if I got my PMP, I doubt anybody will send a note to the company congratulating a particular person. But But that statement may still be true for PgMP and PfMP. As you can see, the PgMP is under 3,000 and PfMP is still under 900. And I became PfMP one of the early adopter group, I think around 2014, and there were 121 of us that got certified in May 2014. And I was one of the first 8 persons. My joke is, by the way, if I check now, I'd probably be one of the first 4th or 5th person because other people may not renew their certification. So at the rate I'm going, hopefully I live long enough, I may be number 1 at some point. PgMP, I became certified in 2010. And later I'll talk about, luckily they have simplified the process, which makes it easier to get the PgMP. So, and I also have RMP, that just did it more for the fun of it. So I speak with a degree of authority because I got audited multiple times. I have multiple certification, went through this process multiple times. Thanks, Susan. I will make it to number 1. Actually, I'm not sure. The number 1 person who finished PfMP is actually not much older than me. He's very active. So I'll have to be in my 80s, I think, before that happens. But putting numbers aside. So let's look at the certification process. For people who want the PMI certification, any of these 8, basically they follow the same 2 steps. Step A, get the application. And application is not always easy. So it's not simply filling out something, send it in, and you get automatic stamp of approval. If anything, in PgMP, PfMP world, it may actually be quite rigorous and difficult. The second piece is the examination. Generally speaking, you have 1 year after PMI give you the thumb up on your application to complete the examination, and you can have up to 3 tries. Now, remember, the reexamination fee can be quite expensive, so these are not freebies, but nonetheless, you have 3 tries. If you fail after the 3rd attempt and still didn't pass, you have to wait for a year and restart the application. So the penalty isn't huge because a year, frankly, goes by very quickly. Just think about 2020. It just went by like a blur. Let's look at the application process, which is something we will dive deeper into, of course. Generally speaking, there are actually 3 steps. Some cases, only 2 steps. Okay, so there is the completion review. And this is where PMI makes sure you have your experience. So for PMP, for example, assuming you have your bachelor degree, it's 3 years of experience, leadership experience, be clear, just not any experience. So if you're able to describe the completed PMI agree with you, then you pretty much could pass the completion review. Having said that, on PgMP and PfMP, the completion review may very well be the most difficult part of getting a pass. And part of the reason is because the people reviewing the application are what I call administrators. They're not necessarily program or portfolio experts. So what they have probably in front of them is a checklist. You know, does John or Jill have these experiences? And because they're really not experienced, if you use words to describe otherwise relevant experience, but in the words that they don't really understand, you don't get that check mark. So in some ways, I found that on the advanced applications for PfMP, PgMP, the completeness review is ironically the harder piece. Because later when you get to the step 3 of panel review, these are reviewed by peers who already have the certification. These are people who have a lot of experience in, let's say you use words that they're not familiar with or not in the standard, they probably could get by. They probably could make sense of it. So that doesn't mean you always pass the panel review, of course. They may evaluate and say you don't have the right experience. But generally speaking, what I found is people stumble on the completeness review. Now, for PMP, there is no panel review, so the completeness review is it. Having said that, you still have to make the description, and later we'll get into a little bit of detail, as vivid as possible. This is especially true, and that's true for all certification, by the way, that if your job title doesn't naturally fall into the certification you're going after. So let's say you want PMP, but your job title is team lead or operation manager, right? Or even store manager for that matter, Right? It doesn't necessarily jive with project management immediately. Clearly, a store manager could do a lot of projects, but the title itself isn't saying you are upfront a project manager. And that's true for program portfolio management as well. So in the situation in which your real job title deviates from that of sort of say project program portfolio manager or risk management if you're on the applying for the RMP certification, just be prepared to do some more explanation, right? Explain why your risk experience is worthy of the RMP or agile experience for the ACP or project experience for the project PMP. So that's the first step, and we'll dive a little bit in detail. But generally speaking, you should hear back about 5 to 10 days. Now, I have to say, I hear a lot of murmurs from the people that come to us for application help that it's often taking longer than that. I do believe PMI is doing a pretty good job catching up. So these murmurs happen more in the earlier side of the year during the initial phases of the pandemic. But having said that, occasionally I still hear delays, especially from the panel review. The second piece is the audit. Now, not everybody gets audited. According to general research, it shows somewhere between 5 to 10%. Personally, I actually believe it's higher, mainly because I got audited twice, and I have 4 certifications, so that's almost 50%. Either I'm extraordinarily unlucky or lucky, I guess, depending how you look at it, but you can get audited. It is a random selection, at least in theory, and they really just want to make sure you are who you are. You have done what you say you have done. You have the education that you state you have. So for CAPM, for example, I'm a university professor. It's pretty straightforward. You could send in your transcript. For PMP and the other more experienced, they essentially go to the people you put in the application and ask your supervisor, whoever you put in, to essentially validate the experience you have. Education, of course, you could send in certificate of completion, which, as a note, if you ever go for training, especially with a reputable training company, always get a certificate of completion because they don't actually expire. So PMP, as you know, have 35 hours of training requirement. For the most part, I never heard PMI reject somebody because the training was outdated. So they could be good for a very long time. And then after the audit, if you get triggered, of course, if you may not, then they ask you a payment. And the payment's pretty straightforward. Most people, I think, just go online and pay via credit card. The third step here, and again, third step is really only for PgMP and PfMP that I know of. Your application now has a couple of detailed questions, and there are 5 of them pertaining to the 5 performance domains of the program management or the portfolio management standard. And here, people then have obviously fill out the best they can. We'll go through some of the tips, which is really the bulk of this webinar. But they send it, PMI send it anonymously to a couple of their volunteers who have agreed to view and review the application. In generally speaking, they sent to 2 people. If both people that they sent to thought the application was good, you have the required experience to meet the particular certification, then you get a pass and you now essentially finish with the application process. If both parties disapproves, that's also straightforward. You are rejected. And if you're rejected, I believe you have to wait for a year before you reapply. The question really comes in when one approve and one disapprove. Then what PMI does is send it to a third volunteer. And again, it's anonymous, so they don't know each other. And that person essentially adjudicates. If the person approves, then to approve, you get a pass. And if that disapprove, then it's to disapprove, and you get a negative. When they go to that third person, this is when it takes quite considerable time, especially, I think, in the pandemic year. I have heard stories of people having heard back from PMI for 40 days, which is really outside their window. So generally, it may take up to 30 days. That's their service level agreement, so to speak. On the other hand, I have heard stories that took significantly longer time. Again, if people have questions, please jump in. Okay. Next couple slides, I'm going to record. This is being recorded, so my suggestion is for people to sort of pause and review this. Right. This lay out the A certifications, the requirements for those certifications. I have to admit, if there's a mistake, please let me know because I did this pretty quickly. But it gives you a bird's eye view of the qualifications required for these A certifications. Okay. Again, I'm not going to go read through this in detail. You could pause here. And that's, by the way, true for the next one as well. This shows the examination fee. Even though this webinar isn't about examination, I thought it's worthwhile for people to know and sort of have a view of, what does it take to pass the exam. One of the things to note is this middle column here around the seconds per question. This is an important note. This gives you the sense of timing. What is the cadence that you have to reach in order to pass this exam, right? So most of these exams are 3 to 4 hours, somewhere in between. And most of these exams are about 200 questions or 170. In the case of CAPM, is a little bit shorter. The important note that I always have here as people prepare for the exam is, remember, as an average adult, assuming you're an educated adult who reads quite frequently, you could read a novel, let's say something you enjoy reading, at about, 200 words a minute, give or take, right? If you, on the other hand, reading technical material, that speed drops to somewhere between 80 to 100 words a minute. Now, if you think about the PMI questions, generally, especially when you go after PgMP, PfMP, the question itself may be 50, 60, 70 words, and then you have 4 multiple choices. Each of these choices could go a couple more words. Collectively, each question was roughly, give or take, somewhere between 80 to 100 words. And some of them, by the way, could be considerably longer. Which means that if nothing else, your pure reading speed of that question will take you a minute. And if you think about it, if you only have 70 or 84, 85 seconds per question on average, that also means that you have essentially only somewhere between 10 to 15 seconds to think, process, select, and click next. That is not a lot of time. And especially given that you have the 4 hours and assuming you don't even take any break, right, you're going to get mentally tired. So just keep that in mind as you prepare for the exam. The hardest thing about the exam, assuming you have the knowledge, assuming you have the experience, is frankly staying mentally alert, sharp. Read the question fast, find the answer, and by the way, the worst thing about most of these exams, other than CAPM, is you're really not looking for correct answer anymore. You're looking for the best answer, which also means you have to read all the choices. So just take that into consideration, and you could see the exam fee and the re-examination fee, should you need to. This is just continuing education. You could pause here too to read it through detail. All PMI certification, now including CAPM, and this is new. Up until October of this year, CAPM just expires after 5 years. Now CAPM can be renewed. This is something new in the PMI world. But generally speaking, it's a 3-year renew cycle. I think many of you probably have heard the need to earn PDUs or professional development unit. And it's largely broken into 2 areas, the education and sort of the giving back to the project management profession and the community. So you could see sort of the rough requirements here. Here's minimum is, if, for example, if you have PMP, you have to have at least 8 technical, 8 leadership, 8 strategic. There's 11 floaters, meaning it could be any of those as long as you meet the 8, combined with 35. So again, pause here if you're interested to read in detail. This is just background information. Okay, hold on, I see there's another question came in. Good point. Charmaine made a comment. PfMP, over here, you actually could share some of the PDUs. The project, program, and CAPM, so PMP, CAPM, and the PgMP shares all PDUs, technical, leadership, strategic. The other ones, though, the more specialty one, let's call it, the PfMP, ACP, RMP, they share the leadership and strategy or strategic, but they don't share the technical. And when I say share, it means double dip. So, for example, I have 4 certifications. I only need to suffice 8 leadership and 8 strategic, all four of my certifications. But I need 8 for PfMP, that's technical. I need 8 more just for risk, 4 more for risk, since risk has fewer requirements. And I need 8 for project and program management. So the technical is where the splinter happens. So you need to have those technical PDUs. Okay? So let's think about planning your application, since this is the heart of our workshop. Now you're ready to roll up your sleeve, and you're going to say, okay, I'm ready to do this. There's basically 3 major advice I have. And this is, by the way, written in a blog article. For those who are interested in the blog article, you can see the blog article as well. And this is posted online. So later I'll give you the address for the blog article. It goes a lot more deeper than what I'm going to present here in terms of some of the advice. Oops, this is the wrong blog article, actually. This is the blog article for the webinar. That's this one. It's an earlier blog article that I had. So this goes into a lot more detail. So for those of you who want to see more examples, read through this, help yourself. But coming back to the presentation. So the 3 advice I gave people is, 1, think a little bit more broadly. And this is because your title may not actually meet, the exact title they're looking for. The second is drinking the Kool-Aid. I'll explain what that means, but essentially you want to immerse yourself in the PMI language. And the 3 is make sure you find all the references that you need before you submit the application. This is in case you get audited. Okay? So let's dive a little bit deeper. Oh, I see Susan have a question. What I do is focus on agile and risk for my ACP and RMP, and also contour my PMP. Good. Thank you, Susan, for that good advice. So planning your application, and let's just think broadly, right? Make sure you want to capture your relevant experience, whether it's project, program, portfolio. Again, I'm using these 3 primary as examples in this webinar, but it applies to Agile, applies to risk as well. So you want to make sure you have that leadership experience. The key word is leadership. It's not the fact that you're working as a team member on a program, portfolio, or project, or in the PMO. This is especially true if your title just doesn't match. Like I said, example, you're a store manager, but you've probably done a lot of projects. I mean, think of every renovation, roll out new products, putting a new system for whatever, cashier system, right? All of these are genuine, bona fide projects, but your title is store manager. So you need to be able to explain that. So, for example, take a look at the PMP, a project management professional. Leadership experience includes, but not necessarily limited to these, right? Leading people in teams, analyzing project data, gathering insights, use intelligence on project implementation, right? So making decisions, which is the next one, especially difficult choices in a high-stake environment, creating or approving important project artifacts, such as charters or project management plan, executing communication plan, engaging stakeholder. Any of the 10 knowledge areas in the 49 processes that you see in PIN Box 6 essentially can require that leadership experience. Right? So definitely think broader. If you're looking at program and portfolio management, a couple more specific suggestions here is, at the program management, make sure that you focus at the program management level. Even though in real life, as a program manager, you may dive into project management activities. Let's say you have a project manager that's not working particularly well. I mean, I being a program manager, I often go in and try to straighten things out. But for the sake of the application, make sure you don't necessarily describe that other than perhaps rescue, but make sure you keep your responsibility at the program level, overall level, right? This is where the program accountability and performance management becomes really important. And in some cases, and there are exam questions like this, that's true for portfolio as well. Will a failure of one project, for example, be acceptable on a program or portfolio? And the answer may very well be yes. It depends on the question because you're responsible for the program, not for that project. Hence, you need to think strategically. Programs in PMI's world are generally a direct response to some kind of strategic objective. Right? If the company has a strategic objective, we want to improve our sales by 10%. Well, there could be a series of projects in the program to improve that sales. A program can also have many types of components. A lot of people just think, oh, the component must be a project. That's true, it is, and it's probably dominant too, but there are at least two other types that PMI talk about. One are operational activities, and other is smaller subsidiary programs. Okay? So keep in mind that when you talk about components of a program, it's just not project, it's actually more than that. And then when you describe your application, describe the program, I always suggest people start with basic sense. My program is about this, and then fill in the blank. And here, try to align to the strategic value. And then the next sentence, and it contains these components, or these projects and operational activities. And then spell out what they are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Because if you don't explain that, very often programs just come across as a large project. There is no distinction, right? Unless you get into that project level. So that's how I would describe every one of the programs. Go to the right side, portfolio. It's actually quite similar. In the portfolio, your responsibility is down at the portfolio level, even though in real life you may jump into project and program activity. That is true for the accountability as well. If anything, there's often a question on the test that do ask, is it acceptable to have failure of a few projects? And the answer is absolutely yes. Project portfolio manager may purposely terminate project early and say want to use those resources for something that's more valuable in the portfolio. When you describe portfolio, also make sure you sort of let this idea sink in. Portfolio is considered the bridge between planning and execution. So as much as possible, talk about what this bridge is, and it's more than just execution. One of the biggest reasons that application, I think, gets rejected is because the portfolio manager is so focused on the implementation and execution side that they forgot or may not even have the right experience to have the ideation, right? The governance around prioritization, the scoring, the approval of the business cases, and also ultimately responsible for some part of the portfolio operation. So when you think about that, that bridge between planning and execution is more than just getting your hands dirty and doing the work. It's making sure the ideas are sound, they're prioritized, they're approved, they have the right level of resources before you get into the project program management of it, eventually into the operation. Portfolio can also have many types of components. Similar to program, in this case, just a broader umbrella. It could have other portfolio, programs, project, operation activity. And there is a category, not so much in the PMI standard, but it happens in the ISO standard, talk about other activities too. This is what I meant by making sure you think broadly. And one of the suggestions I have is, I don't have an example of a template here, but it's really easy. If you're looking and say, well, do I have project program or portfolio experience, whatever certification you want to go after, get a sheet of paper, create Excel, write down the major things you have done, break it down into the major task, and let's say you're going after PMP, ask the question, is this a project-oriented task, and is this a project leadership task? So create two columns, and then put sort of the rough duration. And you could see the leadership column as you check those boxes, and look at the duration. Does it add up to 3 years, for example, if you have your bachelor degree? And then next to it, you may want to put, who you want to refer and mention in the application, because that may come up in audit. The second step is drinking the Kool-Aid. This is really mainly because of the completion requirement. It's a very easy recommendation to make. It's a little bit difficult to achieve because you now have to actually read and understand it. But in short, read the relevant PMI standards. As I'm sure you know, there's the PMBOK for PMP, there is the program standard for PgMP, there is the portfolio standard for PfMP. By the way, this is a bit ironic, but if you read the portfolio management standard, read the 3rd edition. This is because the exam is based on the 3rd edition, not the latest 4th edition. And I say that with a degree of heartburn because I was a core team member writing the 4th edition. Right? So we created an edition, but we also updated fairly significantly that the PMI hasn't caught up with its exam. So for the sake of the certification, ironically, my recommendation to people is read the earlier edition of the standard, not the edition that my core team and all of us worked on. So generally, before you fill out the application, you should read the standard. And here you want to focus on understanding the life cycle, the knowledge area in PMBOK, or it's called the performance domain in the standard for program portfolio management, the relevant processes and artifacts, the relevant tools and techniques. So as much as possible, you could try to map your vocabulary, the words that you may use in your industry or company, to those in the standards. Also, for the program portfolio management, there are underlying principles. It's actually not explicitly stated. We'll go through this in our training, but PMI doesn't actually explicitly state those principles, but there are some implicit ones that you want to understand. That's the first recommendation. So this takes a couple of hours. Reading PMBOK, by the way, it's almost 900-some pages, so it'll take a couple of days. The second recommendation is read the associated examination content outline. I have always considered this to be the second most important document, maybe the third in some cases, when preparing for the certification. This is mainly because this document is based on a massive road delineation study, and it contains the tasks that actual project program portfolio manager actually do. So it's important because in this case, you could see what people do and make sure you try to fit your words to the reasonable extent using that type of language. Right? And lastly, if you want, you could also read the handbook. The handbook isn't really going to help you much on the application, but give you a better sense of the certification. The last of the 3 recommendations is find your references. Right? In all of these assignments that you put in, there's a box going to ask, essentially who your reference will be. This is especially important when you get audited. But as you reflect on your experiences, I mentioned the Excel, you write everything down, create a column. Who's the contact that I want to reach out to should I get audited? By the way, my suggestion is call them up front or email them, ask them for permission, or at least if you're on very good terms, just give them a heads up. You want to do this for a couple of reasons. One is if you put somebody on there that's no longer around or easily found, it could delay your audit. Right? That's one. 2 is that it gives you a chance to reconnect your network. When you do that, when you put in the references or the name of people or the contacts on the application, my general recommendation is go with one of each if you have 3 experience. First, I think sponsor or someone from the governance team is one of the best references because they're your boss or manager or somebody who oversees you. The second is someone who's a direct report, whom you manage during the associated project program portfolio. And the third is a customer or client. So let's say if you're working on PgMP, program management, you have 3 experiences, 3 contacts, ideally pick one of each. By the way, the 4th one you want to pick is somebody who's your peer. That, to me, is a little bit lower priority because chances are you didn't work on the same program, portfolio, or project, but that could still vouch for you. This is especially true if you report to a PMO and you two are just peers of each other. So there could be that 4th option. So in other words, if you have, let's say, 3 job experience, working on that program application, try not to put 3 sponsors, especially if it's the same sponsor across the project, across those programs, or 3 direct reports, or 3 customers. Sort of share the love a little bit and have a sponsor, a direct report, and the customer. And make sure you have the contact information, and ideally they agree that should you be audited, then you can, of course, get them to respond to basically a form you sign and essentially say, I vouch that person X had these experiences and done a good job. Right? So it's pretty straightforward audit, but nonetheless you want to prepare for it. Last time I got audited, I think I passed the audit in less than 3 days because, again, I was prepared. So some cases, people could take a long time. So that's why you want to do that homework up front. Okay, so that's sort of overview. Let's go into a little bit in the specific around the PMP, PgMP, and PfMP. In the PMP application, that's true for most of the other certification. They ask you to describe your experience. So here, you want to make sure you concisely summarize your experience. The application essentially says there is a 200 to 500 word limit in PMP. I think the limit of 500 words is actually lifted. So if you have 550 words, that should be okay. Our recommendation is to use that space. In other words, even if the minimum is 200, try to get to at least 300, 350 words. Because you want to have some meat in there, right? You want to have some detail that people can assess and say, John or Joe, you have that experience. Concisely describe the project objectives, what are the outcomes, what are your roles and responsibilities, especially the leadership roles and responsibilities, and what are the key project deliverables. So when you describe your roles and responsibility, focus on sort of the words from the relevant standard, right? And as much as possible, try to explain or describe in a logical fashion. Life cycle is a great way because it shows that you have an organized mind, organized set of responsibilities that naturally falls into some logical order, happen to be life cycle. Could be something else, but life cycle is as good as any, meaning start with initiation, going to planning, going to executing, monitoring, controlling, eventually closure. Right? Just a very nice flow. The next comment on the bottom, avoid overlapping experience, is somewhat controversial. Actually, among our trainers, we actually didn't truly agree on this one. One of them suggested that you shouldn't be afraid of overlapping experiences. While I recently had, actually not even too long ago, 2 months ago, a client that we were helping reviewing the application was failing because of overlapping experiences. And granted, that was PgMP, not PMP. So my suggestion is if you don't have enough experience, let's say the 3 years you need for PMP, obviously put in what you have. But if you have plenty of experiences, try not to make them too overlap. This is especially true later when you get to the portfolio and the program side, that it's not only overlap of, let's say, in program management with another program, but overlapping program with that of project. That's what gets quite controversial. Some additional guidelines for PMP. Emphasize the unique skills and tasks for the projects, for each project, so they're more varied. So it shows that you have a wealth of process experience across different type of projects. Tailor each project description to the particular deliverable and stakeholder for that project. So in other words, don't copy and paste. It just shows that you're, at the very minimum, lazy. The goal is to demonstrate on the application of your leadership and skills across the project to create that overall impression that you yourself is a real bona fide project manager. Use straightforward language and concise language. Avoid fillers, jargons, acronyms as much as possible. And only use the PMBOK guide terms when they fit naturally. So this one is an interesting one because this comment contradicts something I said earlier. You want to use their language. What happens is earlier, when we first started helping people with application, we recommended people using the standard language, but they force fit it. And when you read it, it just doesn't make good sense. Yes, you got the words right, but it just didn't flow. So you clearly know the person was just grabbing straws and filling as much as possible. And this comes across to the reader. This actually is a bigger problem in PgMP and PfMP. So our recommendation now shift this slightly. Yes, you want to use the PMBOK terms, but make sure you internalize it first, so they fit and flow nicely with what you're trying to say. Don't actively call it a communication management plan when communication plan would do perfectly fine, right? So, and because it's in the context of that sentence. So that's what we meant by use the terms, but make sure it flows well. Make sure it is yours. Make sure it's not something you're just grasping out of a textbook or the standard. And then also use the appropriate verb tense. If something that happened in the past, it's a past project, then of course it should be past tense. If it's a present project you're still working on, then make sure you use present tense. Right? So those are important. Those comments, by the way, applies for PgMP, PfMP as well, even though they were more focused on the PMP. Because on PgMP and PfMP, there's actually additional section that you really don't have on the other certification, and that's 5 short essays. These essays are very specific. They'll ask you, for example, how do you apply risk management techniques to blah, blah, blah on the program, right? So your job is to answer these questions as directly as possible, as succinctly as possible. Granted, when I say succinctly, means still giving the full detail. And by the way, for all those questions, they usually give you A, B choice. So essay 1, you have A and B. Essay 2, A and B. And they don't necessarily fall into a fixed routine, but generally speaking, one of the choices tend to be a little bit more on the strategic side. The other question on the B side tend to be a little bit more hands-on. So in other words, they're looking for application, and you could tell from the question. Our recommendation for the 5 essays, one is address the question directly. If they ask you how you set up your governance, your answer should be, I set up my governance this way. Right? In other words, don't give them a definition of governance. They probably know. There's no reason to do that. To focus on the key characteristics of the underlying endeavor. So if the endeavor happened to be a project doesn't have this, program portfolio, then describe that, what that is. Be as concrete as possible. In other words, be specific. Even maybe going to some point, for example, on risk management, you could say, for example, or for instance, on this particular portfolio governance meeting talking about risk, this is what I have done to set the team up. And get into a little bit of the detail. So make it real, make it tangible, so people know you're not having fluff. One of the worst way, by the way, to answer those questions, you get textbook answer. And you could tell if it's a textbook answer if you take it out of the question, does it still read as if nothing happened? And if it is, that means it's just a textbook answer. 4, do use some PMI jargon, but use it with care. This goes back to the same earlier point. Make sure it flows nicely. So in other words, if you never really develop a portfolio management plan, don't use that word, because you'll probably just come across as really contrived, right? I mean, sort of fake in that sense. The essay has a limit, and I believe this limit is still counts, of 500 words. So if you put in 501 words, you'll say too many words. As a matter of fact, we have participants who actually try to get around this by creating terms or using contraction instead of they are, use their, or something like that, just to shrink the number of words. But other side, people sometimes, get right very simple essay answer, 100 words, 200 words. Our suggestion is to at least have 300, 350 words. Something, again, meaty enough, concrete enough that the reviewer, in this case will be the panel reviewer, could relate to your experience. And then number 6, use proper English. This sounds, perhaps obvious, but believe it or not, we had application review. We do application review, and there was, I still remember a couple times, and one was particularly prominent, that I spoke with the candidate on the phone, and this person, English wasn't his first language, but he was very fluent and had no problem interacting whatsoever. And then he sent us the application. And this is really almost a strange sort of, I felt like a little bit out-of-body experience, because you read the application, every word makes sense. The sentence itself is okay. I mean, it could be phrased better, and English isn't even my first language, so who am I to criticize? But the paragraph doesn't make as much sense. And then the worst is one paragraph flowing to the next paragraph seems to be disjointed. So in other words, while you could read every single word, you could read most of the sentences, you cannot make sense of the paragraph. And at the end of the day, when you really finish reading, you're scratching your head. What is it trying to say? We went back and forth a little bit. After some digging, we realized the person wrote in his native language, I think it was Arabic, used something like Google Translate, right? Translate it into English. So as I'm sure you know those translation software, they get the words pretty good. The sentence isn't too bad, but the meaning got lost around the paragraph. And by the way, that became such a negative experience that even when our company helped people with application, I would say to them, we reserve the right to reject application review because it is so time-consuming to fix English at that point. And so you can imagine we aren't cheap, and we're not the best use of our time. So if English is not your primary language, or if you have some concerns, have your wife, have your friend, hire an English editor. They're not expensive. Help you to do that. You don't want to reach out us to do that because it's just too expensive. So that's really our suggestion. Make sure it's written in at least good English. It flows nicely. It doesn't have to be American English. British English is fine. Australian English is fine as well, but it should be proper English. Okay. So some do's and don'ts, and some of them we sort of gather already. But here's sort of a quick, last-minute review of the good practices. Do plan ahead. Take time to gather information. This is especially true if your job title just doesn't match what you're trying to do or trying to pursue. Reach out to your contact and make sure they can vouch for your experience. Use the PMI lexicon, but make sure you use it naturally and appropriately. Do use first-person I whenever possible, because PMI is asking you for your experience. If anything, actually avoid using we unless you genuinely meant we. So not say don't use we, but as a lot of people, I think a lot of us professionals are trained to do, right? Don't want to be selfish. It's the team, not just me. So we always say, we have done this. In reality, of course, you're the person doing it. So in that case, stick with I. But when you say we, because if you're reading to your entire team, of course, do use we. But avoid it just because it's being politically correct. Also, be real. Examine your qualification critically. And this is where I take a hard stand. When I used to, for example, lead global project services for one of the big 6 tax audit accounting firm, I hire 24 project professionals every single year, and possibly more than that when you look at even the freelancers and the contractors from the vendors. I have never hired somebody just because they have a certification. So one of the worst things you could do to your credential actually is to have, say, PMP, but nothing on the resume show you actually have project leadership experience. Because that is a huge flag that most of us who are in the professional space and know this well to avoid. These are people who attained the certification for the sake of certification, but couldn't really do the job. And that is an auto elimination criteria in my book. So that's why I suggest to people, when you apply for PMP, I have a lot of students who do apply, please make sure you genuinely have that 3 years of experience. Make sure you're able to take on the work as the PMP, meaning independently lead a moderate-sized project. to be the effort required to complete the application. I have known people who went around with PMP on this completeness review cycle, like 2, 3, 4, 5. I think one person was 6, 7 times. Now, the good news is PMI does give you feedback, and we actually have a library of these. Our trainer who does a lot of the application review started tracking them. So, we could help you there, but nonetheless, plan your time accordingly. Do not exaggerate your experience. Even if you qualify for the certification, you may have a difficult time in the exam. This is especially true on the PgMP, PfMP side. Almost most of the questions are some kind of scenario, so you have to understand it. Do not try to say everything about your experience, especially on the essay. Focus on the question and focus on answering the question as directly as possible using somewhere around 350 to 500 words. Right? And don't be afraid to claim appropriate responsibilities even if your job or title does not match. Let's say you're going after a program management PGMP certification and your title is in program management. If you're not sure about certain experience you have programmed and you believe it should be included, make a statement and say it. And so don't be afraid to get the credit where credit is due. This is the link to the article that I shown you here that gives a little bit more detail for anybody who's interested to read the article. And eventually I'll post the webinar here as well. So this really ends the presentation. And very quickly, for those of you who may not know PMO Advisory, we are a registered education provider. We are right now in the application to become the PMI's ATP authorized training partner. As you know, PMI is changing that a little bit. Our firm is very dedicated to project management. We jokingly call ourselves 1 inch wide, called project management, 1 feet deep, because we do project, program, portfolio, risk, agile, PMO, org change, business execution, so on and so forth. So we offer one of the widest range of the project management certification training, as well as strategic execution training. And if any of you are interested in our upcoming events and courses, you could go to this website. One last note, we don't really actively try to sell our services around application review because frankly, it is not particularly profitable. But we do that as a part of our business to help professionals. So if you are interested in any of our courses, etc., there is an add-on process that you could buy for application review. Generally, as a courtesy, even if you attend our training, we will do a cursory high-level review of your application. Excuse me, just forgot to mute my phone. So we do that application review. But if you want a detailed review for us to give you detailed feedback, there is that fee associated, and you could buy it a la carte. Again, we don't try to actively sell that too much because, frankly, it is very time-consuming for us. Are there any questions? We are now at the end of the presentation. Wow, did I cover everything so well that there is no question whatsoever? Everybody now become application experts? Okay, well, then if there are no further questions, I'll give everybody back 5 minutes of your time and day. So thank you so much for spending Wednesday afternoon with us. Hope everybody finds this to be useful. And again, feel free to browse our website, go to this article to look at some in-depth example. That's a little bit more detail here. And good luck with your pursuit of a PMI certification. Thank you very much. Be safe, and I hope to see you around. Take care.